Hi, I'm Parneet Jaggi, and today we're going to be starting with a few literary terms and their explanations. And in this series, we're going to be taking up the first literary term, which is a plot. Now, a plot may be associated with fiction in the form of novels, short stories, drama. But first, we need to understand what a plot is and how is it different from a simple story. Now, a plot is a literary term used to describe the events that make up a story or the main part, the main section of the story. These events relate to each other in a pattern or a particular sequence. This is how they're going to be moving. So, the structure of a novel or any other work depends on the organization of events in the plot of the story. So, this is how we define plot. It is actually a sequence of interconnected events within the story of a play or a novel or a film, an epic, or it may be any other narrative literary work. So, more than simply an account of what is happening, plot also reveals the cause and effect relationship between those events that are occurring. Now, when we look at its significance, how significant it is known as the foundation of a novel or a story or a drama because it is around this which the characters and settings are built. It is meant to organize information and events in a logical manner. When writing the plot of a piece of literature, the author has to be careful that it does not dominate the other parts of the story. So, this is one feature which explains not just what happens, but how and why the major events of the story take place. But then, the writers also have to take care that the plot doesn't take the entire place of the story or the work, but there should be more features also. There should be characters, there should be location, setting, background, or whatever philosophy or whatever narrative he wants to narrate. They should also form an essential part of the work. Now, before we go into the elements of a plot, let's understand what a plot is and what is a story. When the two are compared, how do we differentiate? Because these two terms, we say that we watched a film, the story was good or the plot was good. So these two terms are closely connected, and as a result, most people use plot and story often interchangeably. But there's a little difference in the two. What is a story? For example, we watch a film. A story is a series of events. It tells us what happened. While when we talk of the plot, a plot tells us how the events are connected to each other and why the story unfolded in the way that it did. Now, if we take it more in a more literary sense, there is a book by E.M. Forster called Aspects of Novel. He used several examples in this book to distinguish between story and the plot. For example, he said, the king died and then the queen died is the story. This is the story. The king died, the queen died. Now, the king died and then the queen died of grief is a plot. Now, because the time sequence is preserved and there is a sense of causality which overshadows it. Or when we say the queen died, no one knew why until it was discovered that it was through grief at the death of the king that she died. Now, this is a plot with a mystery element in it. So, when we look at a work, we look at two different things through it. We have a story and we also have a plot. Now, when we talk of the elements of a plot, there are 5 main elements. The first element is exposition or introduction. Now, this is the beginning of the story where characters and setting are established and the main issue, the main conflict, the main problem is introduced in the exposition. So it gives, we see the key background information. For example, the characters are introduced, their relationships are introduced, the setting is introduced, and even other relevant ideas, details, or we have historical context. These things are introduced in the exposition or the introduction. Then we have the rising action. Now, this rising action occurs when a series of events build up to the conflict. The main characters are established by the time the rising action occurs, and at the same time, events begin to get complicated. It is during this part of a story that excitement, tension, or crisis can be seen. So we see even while we are watching a film, the film starts calmly, peacefully with a humor scene or with a light introduction of characters. But within a few minutes, 10, 15 minutes or half an hour, we see that there is some kind of problem that has been created, or there is some kind of a conflict between the characters or between the events. This is an important part because the next part, the climax, will come because of this essential rising action part of the work. So then we have the third part. The third element is the climax. Now this is the main point of the plot, which is actually a turning point. This is meant to be the moment of highest interest and emotion, which leaves the reader wondering what is going to happen next. Now we have heard the word climax very often, especially when we go out for watching movies. Now, climax is that moment when there is the greatest tension in the movie, or there is the highest conflict in the movie. It is also sometimes called crisis. Now, it may not always be negative. It may be negative. There is some crisis or there is some tension which will be resolved, but it may not always be negative. Now, for example, in a tragedy, if we look at Elizabethan tragedies like Shakespeare and Webster, and we see that this climax will result in mostly unhappy endings. But in comedies, it usually makes it clear that the story will have a happy ending. So normally, if we have a 5-act play, the climax usually takes place towards the end or mid of the third act. Then we have the falling action. Now, falling action is kind of a winding up of the story which is going on. It occurs when events and complications begin to resolve. They are like disentangled. Things are beginning to be solved. The result of actions of main characters are put forward. So now, whereas we see the rising action leads to the climax, the falling action is the series of events which follow the climax. So they are usually towards ending with a resolution. This indicates that the story is now reaching an end. So usually if we have a 5-act play, the falling action takes place generally during the 4th act or towards the end of the 4th act. Then we have the resolution, which is also called conclusion or denouement. Now, denouement actually is a French word which means outcome. This is the outcome of what has happened before. So, during this resolution or denouement, it is the end of the story, which may be happy or tragic according to the quality of the work that you are reading or watching. Now, we watch that the author resolves any outstanding questions about the conflicts, about the fates of characters, and it may even reveal a little bit about the futures of the characters after the resolution of the story. So this denouement or resolution usually takes place in the last act of the play or the work. For example, if we go and watch a film, we generally see that towards the end things have been resolved. If it was violence, the violence comes to an end. Whoever has to die, he dies. Whoever has to live is now seen living. And then there is some hope or some vision of the future that we may see in this resolution or denouement. Now, before we look into a few examples of plot, we may also talk about 7 basic kinds of plots. Now, these are just broad categories. Now, we may have plots like comedies. We have different plots for comedies. because we in this kind of a plot we have events that are challenges, conflicts, misunderstandings with humor. And finally, when the plot is resolved after the climax, the story ends happily. Then we have tragedy, like we have Shakespeare's tragedies like King Lear and Hamlet and Othello. This tragedy kind of a plot has that realization called anagnorisis by Aristotle, in which the hero suddenly realizes his mistake, and then there is a reversal of fate called peripetia, which leads to the tragic ending of the plot. Then we have a plot which is also called the rebirth plot. A rebirth plot means that through an act of love, another character helps the main character overcome the flaw of his character. So there are many stories of rebirth which allude to Jesus Christ and other religious figures who have sacrificed themselves for others and were resurrected. Then we have overcoming the monster kind of a plot. Now these are very common. This monster could be literal or metaphorical, where the hero sets out to fight an evil force, just like we have Spider-Mans and Supermans and Batmans and all that stuff. Then another kind of plot is rags to riches, just as we have these stories like Oliver Twist or Cinderella, or we had this movie called Slumdog Millionaire, in which an underprivileged or a disadvantaged person comes close to gaining huge success and wealth in life. Then we have a plot of quest, in which a hero moves out for a specific work, and like we have these movies in which they have adventure trips to islands and treasure islands and all that stuff. And then we have voyages and returns. Voyages means journeys, like Alice in Wonderland, the Odyssey, and all these. So these are broadly the kinds of plots we have. Now then, when we look into the examples of the plot, nowadays a very common example is J.K. Rowling's book on Harry Potter and Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. So this is probably the most familiar to the youth of today, and the plot of the story begins when Harry learns that Professor Snape is after the Sorcerer's Stone, and the professor lets loose a troll who nearly kills Harry and his friends. In addition, Harry finds out that Hagrid lets out the secret of the giant dog to a stranger in return for a dragon, which means that Snape can now reach the Sorcerer's Stone. Then if we look at our classical literature, we have a very popular novel by Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice. Now this is a romantic fiction in which we have these sisters and they're falling in love with guys, and then that kind of a relationship series which goes on, and which has a very simple yet complex plot in which there are pairs falling into love with each other, and then one of the sisters runs away, and these things happening. Now, why is plot so important? It is one of the most important parts of a work of fiction, whether it is a story or a novel or a drama, because it focuses attention on the important characters and their roles. It also motivates the characters to affect the story in a particular way, and most importantly, it connects the events in an order, in a sequence, in a mechanized form. So the plot creates a desire for the reader to go on reading by absorbing them in the middle of the story, ensuring they want to know what happens next. So we see that it creates a curiosity, it binds the reader, it leads to the climax, and gradually releases the story, the tension of the story, to maintain the interest. During the plot of a book, a reader gets emotionally involved, connecting with the book, not allowing himself to put the book down. And eventually, the plot shows the whole story, reveals the entire story, giving the reader a sense of completion, that he's finished the story and reached a conclusion. So this was a brief analysis of the literary term plot, which is an essential part of any work of fiction. So stay tuned for the next videos, and thank you for now.